There is a kind of grief that has no ceremony, no funeral, no condolence cards, no one asking how you're holding up, because the person is still alive. In the autumn of 1942, a French philosopher named Simone Weil was dying in a sanatorium in Ashford, England. She was 34 years old. She had refused to eat more than the ration allocated to people living under German occupation in France. A form of solidarity so radical that it was killing her. The doctors who attended her could not save her because she would not let them. She died in August 1943. But this story is not about her death. It is about a letter she wrote in the final weeks of her life, a letter to her parents, who were in New York, who knew she was ill, who did not know how ill. The letter was full of news and tenderness. It described her work. It described the countryside around the sanatorium. It told her mother about a book she had been reading. It did not mention that she would be dead within weeks. It did not say goodbye. Her parents received the letter after she had already died. They read it as the living read letters from the dead, looking for what they missed, for what they should have understood, for the signs that were there and that they hadn't seen. Her mother, Selma Weil, spent the rest of her long life returning to that letter, not because it told her anything she didn't know, but because it was the last thing that existed in the space between who her daughter was and who she had become. In the final months, the last artifact of a relationship that had already, without either of them knowing, become something different, a relationship that had ended, while it was still, technically, continuing. I have been thinking about Selma Weil's grief for a long time. Not the grief after the letter, the grief of loss in the usual sense, but the other grief, the one that must have existed in the months before, the quiet, unnamed grief of watching someone you love become unreachable, of being in a relationship that is still present, but no longer available in the way it used to be. That grief is what this video is about. Not the grief of death, the grief that has no name, because the person is still there. You know someone who used to be closer to you than they are now. The relationship still exists. You may still speak. You may still meet for coffee once a month, exchange messages, show up at the same events. But something has shifted quietly over time in a way that was never announced and never quite acknowledged. And the person you are in contact with is not quite the person you were in a relationship with. You notice it in specific, small moments. The way a conversation that used to run for hours now runs out at 40 minutes, and you both feel the approaching end, and neither of you says anything about it. The way a certain topic, one that used to be open between you, is now navigated around, not because of a fight, but because at some point it became easier not to go there. The way you walk away from seeing them, feeling somehow further away than before you arrived. Or a marriage ended, not through death, but through departure, and the person is still in the world, still living a life, still being referenced in conversations, still existing in the photographs that you haven't quite decided what to do with. Or a parent has drifted into something that looks like a stranger, dementia, or addiction, or simply the particular hardening that sometimes happens in old age. And the person who used to be there is no longer accessible in the way they once were. The body is present. The person you knew is somewhere else, or a friendship simply faded. No argument, no rupture, just the slow accumulation of distance, until one day you realize that the person you used to call first is now someone you haven't spoken to in a year, and you don't quite know when it stopped. Each of these is a loss, and almost none of them are treated as losses by the people around you, by the culture that holds you, by the rituals designed to help us through grief. Because the person is still alive, because there's nothing to mourn, technically. Because the appropriate response to a relationship that has changed is supposed to be acceptance, or growth, or moving on, not grief. But you are grieving, and the absence of any language for it, the absence of any ceremony, any permission, any acknowledgement that this is a real loss, makes the grief stranger and heavier than it would otherwise be. It accumulates in the body as a kind of low-grade weight, not the sharp pain of acute grief, but something duller and more persistent, present in the moments you don't expect, arriving with specific objects, specific songs, specific conversations that remind you of how things used to be, and land with the particular sadness of a thing that is over, but hasn't been named as over. Buddhism has a name for this, and it has something to say that most grief conversations leave out. We have encountered the teaching of the two arrows earlier in this series, in the context of resentment and forgiveness, but the teaching applies here with a different and more specific force. The Buddha described being struck by an arrow. The pain is real. It belongs in its own category, unavoidable, legitimate, not to be dismissed. That is the first arrow. But then, he said, most people reach for a second arrow and drive it into the same wound. The second arrow is not the loss. The second arrow is everything. The mind adds to the loss. The questions without answers, the replaying of what might have been different, the refusal to let the wound be simply what it is, without turning it into a verdict about yourself, or about the person, or about the nature of love in general. In the context of grief for the living, the second arrow has a particular shape. It sounds like, they should still be here. This shouldn't have happened. I should have done something differently. If I had said the right thing at the right time, this relationship would still be what it was. Or it sounds like, this means the whole thing was false. If someone can become a stranger, the love that existed between us wasn't real. Or it sounds like, something is wrong with me, that I am still grieving this, still not over this, still returning to this, years after it ended. These are second arrows, every one of them. Not because the questions they contain aren't real, but because they function as additional wounds applied to a wound that is already there. They do not help you grieve. They prevent you from grieving. They transform the clean, appropriate pain of a genuine loss into a tangle of guilt and judgment and confusion that cannot be processed, because it is not, at its center, the actual loss. It is the mind's resistance to the fact of the loss. The first arrow is, something real is gone. The second arrow is, it shouldn't be. Buddhism does not ask you to pretend. The first arrow doesn't hurt. It asks you to notice. when you are picking up the second. And here is the thing about grief for the living that makes the second arrow especially difficult to set down. The ambiguity feeds it. When someone has died, the loss has a confirmed shape. There is a before and an after. The second arrows still come. The what-ifs, the should-have-saids, but they are aimed at a fixed point. When the loss is ambiguous, when the person is still there, when the relationship technically continues, when the ending has no official date, the second arrows have no fixed point to aim at. They circle. Should I have tried harder? Is there still something I could do? Is this really over, or am I giving up? Am I grieving something that isn't actually gone? And in grieving it, am I making it more gone than it needs to be? These questions feel like they have answers. They do not. They are second arrows dressed as practical concerns. And the practice, the specifically Buddhist practice, is to notice them for what they are, not useful inquiries, but the mind's way of avoiding the simple, irreducible pain of the first arrow. There is a concept in the Buddhist understanding of grief that has no direct equivalent in Western psychology, though Western psychology has been arriving at it through different routes in recent decades. It is the recognition that grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a response to be completed. The Western approach to grief, organized largely around stages, around processing, around working through, frames grief as something you do until you are done doing it. Buddhism's understanding is different in a way that matters practically. It does not say grief ends. It says grief completes. Ending implies that the grief disappears, that at some point the loss is simply gone, no longer capable of producing pain. Completing implies something else, that the grief has been fully allowed, genuinely acknowledged, genuinely felt, genuinely integrated, and that you now carry it, not as an unhealed wound, but as a scar that is part of your landscape. The grief doesn't go away. It changes shape. It becomes something you have lived with long enough to know where it lives in you, and to know that you can live alongside it without being controlled by it. The psychologist Pauline Boss coined a term in the 1970s that has since become essential to anyone working with the specific kind of grief we are talking about. She called it ambiguous loss. Loss that lacks the clarity of death. Loss where the person is physically present, but psychologically absent, as in dementia, as in addiction, as in the particular kind of withdrawal that sometimes follows trauma or depression, or loss where the person is psychologically present but physically absent, as in the grief of parents whose children have been lost. In circumstances where no body has been found, no death confirmed. Boss discovered, through decades of working with people in both of these situations, that ambiguous loss is harder to process than death, not because the pain is more intense, but because the absence of clarity prevents the grief from completing. You cannot mourn someone who is still, technically, there. You cannot hold a ceremony for a relationship that still exists, officially, even if it no longer functions in the way it once did. You cannot explain to the people around you why you are grieving something that hasn't, in any visible way, ended. So you carry it in a kind of suspension, waiting for a resolution that may not come. unable to grieve fully, because the thing you would be grieving has no confirmed ending. Buddhism's response to this is not a solution. It is a reframe. The teaching of anicca, impermanence, does not only apply to things that end completely, it applies to everything, including things that are still present. The relationship you are grieving has changed. The person you love is not the same person they were when the relationship was what it was. Neither are you. Anicca does not say, "This is tragic." It says, "This is the nature of everything." Every relationship changes. Every person changes. The version of this relationship that you are grieving was always temporary, not because it was false, but because everything is temporary. The love was real. The change is real. Both of these things are true at once. And the grief is real, not as evidence that something went wrong, but as the appropriate response of a mind that loved something and is now reckoning with its change. There is a passage in the Therigatha, the Songs of the Elder Nuns, one of the oldest collections of Buddhist poetry, where a nun named Amrapali reflects on the changes that age has brought to a body that was once celebrated for its beauty. She lists them without self-pity and without denial. The hair that was once black and fragrant is now like hemp. The eyes that were bright are now dimmed. The hands that were smooth are now rough with age. She does not say, "This is fine." She does not say, "I don't grieve this." She says, "Such is the nature of things." And in that acknowledgement, not acceptance in the sense of pretending it doesn't hurt, but acceptance in the sense of letting it be true, there is something that functions like peace. Not the peace of resolution, the peace of honest reckoning. There is something that needs to be said plainly. The grief of losing someone who is still alive does not resolve the same way. The grief of losing someone who has died resolves. And waiting for it to resolve in that way, waiting for the clarity, the closure, the moment when it simply becomes the past, is part of what makes this particular grief so difficult to carry. It may not close, not because you are doing grief wrong, not because you haven't processed enough, or forgiven enough, or let go enough, but because ambiguous loss resists closure by its nature. The person is still in the world. The relationship still technically exists. Every time something reminds you of them, a place, a song, a situation that they would have handled a certain way, the loss becomes present again, not as a memory, but as a new encounter with the fact of what is gone. And that encounter does not diminish simply because time has passed. Buddhism does not promise that grief will eventually stop arriving. It offers something different. The recognition that a grief which keeps returning is not a grief that has failed to heal. It is a grief that is proportionate to the love that preceded it. The grief visits because the love was real. The love was real because the relationship was real. The relationship was real even though it changed. Holding all of that simultaneously, without needing the grief to end in order for the loss to be valid, without needing the loss to be complete in order to be real, is not a destination. It is a practice, done again and again, each time the grief returns. If you have been carrying a loss like this, a relationship that changed, a person who became unreachable, a version of something that no longer exists, and you have been carrying it in the particular way that ambiguous loss tends to get carried, quietly, without acknowledgement, without giving it the name grief, because it didn't feel like you were allowed to. I want to say something directly to you. What you have been carrying is real. The absence of a ceremony does not make the loss less of a loss. The absence of a word for it does not make it less true. The fact that the person is still alive, the fact that others might look at your situation and see nothing that requires mourning, does not mean there is nothing to mourn. Buddhism's teaching on grief is not that you should grieve only losses that the world has agreed to call losses. It is that suffering arises wherever there is genuine attachment to something that has changed, and that suffering deserves to be met honestly, with the same quality of attention, the same permission to be felt, the same gentleness that you would offer any wound. There is also this: the grief you have been unable to name may have been working on you in ways you haven't recognized, showing up as a low-grade guardedness, a reluctance to invest in new connections with the same openness you once had, showing up as a particular flinch when someone gets close to the territory where the old relationship used to live, showing up as an inability to fully trust that what is good now will not also, eventually, become something you have to grieve. Naming the grief does not cure these things, but it begins the process of locating them accurately, of understanding that what feels like a general wariness about love is often, at its source, a specific unprocessed loss. The grief visits because the love was real. The love was real because the relationship was real. The relationship was real even though it changed. You are not too old to grieve this. You are not too far removed from it. You are not beyond the point where naming it can matter. The grief is still there because the love was real, and love that was real deserves to be grieved properly, which means, honestly, even if late, even if quietly, even if only to yourself. The one thing I'd like to leave you with is permission. Permission to grieve the things that the world hasn't given you language for. The relationship that changed without warning. The person who is still there, but no longer reachable. The version of something that existed and was real and is now gone, not through death, but through the ordinary, relentless movement of time. You don't have to call it grief out loud. You don't have to explain it to anyone. You don't have to wait for the right moment, or the right container, or the right level of certainty about what exactly you are grieving. Grief does not require a confirmed ending. It requires only that you stop insisting it shouldn't be there. The second arrow, the story that you shouldn't be grieving this, that there is nothing to grieve, that grief without a funeral is somehow illegitimate. That is the arrow you can put down. The first arrow, the actual ache of the actual loss, that you can simply hold without explaining it, without resolving it, without waiting for it to finish before you decide it was real. Simone Weil's mother received that letter after her daughter was dead. She had no ceremony for the grief of watching her daughter become unreachable in the months before. No language for the loss. of a relationship that was still technically happening, while already being irretrievably changed. But she carried it. For the rest of her long life, she carried it, alongside the love, alongside the memory, alongside the ordinary fact that the world continued, and she continued in it. That is not failure. That is how it is done, not resolved, carried with honesty, and with the recognition that what you are carrying is proportionate to what you loved. If something in this landed somewhere that needed it, a loss you've been carrying without a name, let it be named now. Just here, just privately. That is enough. Next time, we reach the end of this series. The last thing that has been underneath all of it, beneath every conversation about forgiveness, and patterns, and parents, and grief, and the loneliness of insufficient depth, is impermanence, the oldest Buddhist teaching, the one that changes everything, once you actually let it land. When someone you love changes, and you are not ready. Anicca, I'll see you there. And if this has been worth your time, if it named something real, the simplest thing you can do is stay.